You're listening to the What's Happening podcast with Gary Watts.
Well, today we're going to talk about swimming, and I have the pleasure to have Tom Casavant here with me, who's a professor of engineering at the University of Iowa in several fields. So please welcome Tom Casavant. How you doing, Tom?
Good. Great to be here.
Well, let's talk about swimming. I mean, we met each other a long time ago, and I think I probably saw you at the pool. And I just thought, let's just start out and talk about, how you got started in swimming. Maybe give us a little background,
Sure.
what got you interested in it, how long you've been swimming, and then we're going to start talking about some of the races you've been in and some of the events.
Yeah. I grew up in Western Iowa in Sioux City, and I wish I could have asked my mom why, but she got involved in competitive swimming when I was about 7 or 8 years old. So me and my siblings were all swimmers. It wasn't something that everybody did. It was a little bit different, but I just loved it. And there was no question that was kind of one of my favorite things to do. And so as I grew up, I swam in high school, and I always kind of joke that thankfully I wasn't good enough to swim in college because it's pretty difficult to be a competitive collegiate athlete and study engineering. So I'm glad I'm an engineer and I got into that field, but I've never stopped swimming. I have been doing master's swimming for a long time in different settings, both as part of a U.S. Masters team, but also just on my own and with groups of friends. And then probably kind of fast forwarding to, I didn't start actually swimming in open water until I was about 50 years old. And I had a daughter who was she had just graduated from college and was back in Iowa City, and she wanted to go and swim at City Park Pool one day at noon. And I really didn't know anything about that, and ended up going, and they have a 50-meter long course pool configuration over the noon hour, and met some really interesting people who have become really great friends over the years and started swimming. And then she got a job less than a week after that where she couldn't come and swim with me. So she got me into it and then kind of abandoned me. And then I heard about a swim in Lake Michigan. And later that summer, did my first big shoulder swim in Lake Michigan.
So was that your first real event in Chicago?
Well, almost my first, yeah. I did a swim up in Minneapolis. Actually, I was thinking you reminded me of that. My daughter, I have 3 daughters. The oldest daughter was getting married in Minneapolis, and the daughter who had kind of got me out there to City Park went up to live for a couple of months in Minneapolis and heard that saw a poster for a open water swim in Lake Harriet the morning after the wedding. So she kind of said, "Hey, Dad, there's this open water swim up here. You want to do that?" And I said, "Well, how about you? Do you want to do it?" And she goes, "Yeah, I want to do it." So we're kind of like that in our family. We're challenges and competition are kind of common. And
Right after a wedding, too. Huh?
Yeah, the morning after. It was like 8 o'clock the morning after. So I went online immediately. This is a couple months ahead, and registered both of us. And I just sent her the email and said, "Okay, we're signed up." And I think it was kind of like calling her bluff, but we ended up doing it, and it was kind of fun.
How far?
It was just a 2.5K.
2.5K.
There was a 5K, but we neither one of us had done an open water swim like that. So we were just like, "Oh, we'll do the 2.5. It's the morning after, and then we were up, dancing at the reception till after midnight.
Right.
And then, we went and did this swim.
How cold was the water?
It wasn't too bad. It wasn't a big issue because this is in July, so it was probably in the 70s. Yeah.
So not too bad.
Not a big challenge.
Not like the 50s you're used to, right?
Yeah. So, water temperature is a major component because people who like to swim and swim laps in a pool are used to water that's about 80 degrees. That's kind of the most normal temperature for to keep a pool. And it's amazing how just a couple of degrees lower than that, and people will think that it's freezing cold, right?
Yeah, I hear people complain all the time if it's around 76.
Yeah, well, 76 is definitely kind of deviates more than the normal pool deviation. It's usually about 78 to 82.
Right.
And I can feel every one of those degrees. I know what each one of those different temperatures feels like. And if it gets much above 82, it's really pretty uncomfortable for me. Whereas for most people, if it gets below 78, they start
Right.
complaining a little bit more.
People don't realize that, if you swim for an hour and you're really working at it, you're going to sweat.
Sure.
It sounds a little corny, but how do you sweat in the water? But you do.
Yeah.
So, how did you get used to cold water? Because I know you're at Lake McBride. You swim with the eye cows, and maybe tell us a little bit about McBride and the eye cows and cold water.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating topic, cold water physiology, right? And I've even talked to some doctors. Actually, the current provost at the University of Iowa, Kevin Kriegel, has studied cold water physiology. And one time I met him, he was talking about he wanted to maybe collect some data and interview some of the swimmers. But basically, each person has some built-in mechanisms to try to save their life if they fall into cold water. And so these kind of instinctive reactions are a part of what happens if you decide that you want to try to swim in open water. So as your body enters cold water, doesn't matter who you are, there's an instant sort of survival response that your vascular system close to the surface of your skin just constricts and keeps the blood from going out there and getting cold. So it will try to keep your core warm as long as it can. And each person has kind of a different temperature that they can survive in for a long time by that mechanism. And so I think there is some correlation, kind of, body type, so bigger kind of, people who have more, meat on their bones, so to speak, are more likely to be able to tolerate cold water. But the psychological part, you can train yourself to change the way that you think about cold water if you want to. And so what I mean by that is, as you enter the water, there's this sensation that's like, well, this isn't good, right? This is too cold. I'm used to a shower or a bath or something like that. And this is not that. This is not good. But if you repeatedly just, wade into the water, get in, swim slowly, do that, usually people who who have a desire to do it, okay, because most people don't have a desire to do that. I'll totally acknowledge that. But if they have a desire to do it, after 5 or 6 times, you kind of get to where the term is habituation. So you can get into the water without immediately wanting to run out. After that, you have to learn how to be able to swim in cold water. So breathing is harder. And but after a while, you start to feel like this is just a different feeling. This isn't a bad feeling. This is different. It's cold, but you stop thinking about the cold and you start thinking again about swimming. That takes a while. It takes a while. And like I said, if you don't have the desire to do that, a strong desire to do it, it's just not going to happen. Yeah.
What happens to your internal organs? Do you get 98.9? Do you drop down a few, or do you stay at 98?
Well, I'm going to mention a book that people can read. It's called Swimming to Antarctica. It's an autobiography of Lynn Cox, and she's just an incredible, swimmer. She was a pioneer of cold water swimming, and they did physiological studies of her. And so they had her like swallow a probe that would monitor her internal temperature, and then they put her in ice baths. Or she also swam in the Bering Strait in Alaska between the U.S. and Russia. And that water was, in the 30s. And they really studied what her body core temperature did. And one of the most amazing things about it is that before she got into that water, somehow she knew this was going to happen, and her body temperature started to go up before she got in the water. Wow. And then when she got in, it gradually started to go down, but then it reached an equilibrium stage. But the normal human can't survive if their body temperature falls below about 90 degrees. So think of our normal body temperature about 98. Right. If you actually stay in the water to the point where your core temperature falls below 90, you'll probably die. Right. Even if you get out, it's probably in a range where you probably can't recover from that. So it's pretty sensitive. So your body starts really working to keep the core and your, like you said, your organs, your internal systems. As one of the side effects that happens is if you do start to lose core heat, the blood to your brain needs to be warm. And if it's not warm enough, you really start to lose mental function. So one of the ways that we try to protect swimmers, open water swimmers, is to have a support person in a kayak or in a boat and then periodically ask them questions. And we don't just ask them how they feel it, because quite often a person just before they're going to die feels pretty warm. There's this weird phenomena of this warm rush that comes before your body basically gives up trying to keep warm. So we ask questions that would kind of test their memory and their thinking capability. So, for example, before the swim, you would tell the person a number like 13. And then during the swim, when you'd stop, the person would just say 6. And then the swimmer has to respond with the difference between that first number, which they have to remember, and the number that they were just told. And so if they fail this test, then they've agreed ahead of time that that will be the end of the swim. They'll have to get out.
Wow, that's neat. So you swim at McBride, you swim with the iCows.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell us a little bit about that local group that swims
Sure.
at open water swimming? So a lot of people swim in a pool. It's a controlled environment. You're swimming back and forth. You're following a little black line up and down or whatever. And I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's kind of comfortable and you know the environment. When you get out to McBride and you're open water, when you're looking down, you can't really see anything. It's a little different,
you
different
definitely
process.
Can't see anything at McBride.
So tell us how you got to that point, and tell us about that group that swims at McBride.
Well, so in 2012, I spent a sabbatical semester in Perth, Western Australia, and it was the first chance that I had to really live near the ocean and do open water swimming on a regular basis. We go out with this group every weekend, in addition to swimming in a pool. When I came back from the sabbatical, I was just craving swimming in open water. So I had a friend, Professor Ralph Stevens at Lake McBride, and talked to him and asked him if we could come and swim off of his dock. And as a property owner, he had the right to swim off of his dock, whereas people are not allowed to swim outside of the swimming area at Lake McBride. Right. So he said, yeah, you can do that. So there was about 5 or 6 of us that came out together, and we swam off his dock. We swam a few hundred meters, swam back, and we're like, yeah, that was pretty cool. Maybe we should let's do this again. So we did it again, and gradually we started to swim a little further. At some point, Ralph's neighbors started to complain because they were afraid that we were taking advantage of this, agreement with the DNR and the property owners, and they wanted us to stop. And so we had kind of no choice but to ask the rangers if we could get permission to swim as a group. And to most people's surprise, the rangers were extremely supportive. And so we developed a protocol and an arrangement so that we could get access to the lake, followed some safety procedures. We always have kayakers, following the swimmers, and we register each one of the swims 24 hours in advance with the people who are going to swim. And for 11 years, this group has used that lake, and probably about 200 people have, over that time period, signed up and swim. Our typical swims are 10 to 20 people.
Right. People, to experience it, it's 5 o'clock in the morning. You're headed out there, and the sun's rising on McBride.
It's beautiful.
It's just hard to describe. You get in the water and start going and swim for an hour or so, or whatever people do. It's the most relaxing, peaceful, and the sun coming up. You can't describe it till you do it.
Yeah, it really is. It really is beautiful, and I think a lot of people. So there's a lot of people who don't want to do this.
Right.
Okay, we got to remember that it's not just. It doesn't appeal to everybody. I think people who are used to swimming in a pool where they can see the bottom just think of, I don't want to swim if I can't see the bottom. But for those who want to do it, what you're describing is exactly true. Morning, midday, evening, there's always something special about being in the open water. And just the simple fact that you're kind of meeting nature more on nature's terms. And there may be wind from one direction one day, and water may be colder, or it may have more algae or less.
No, it's great. And you do have kayak support service, which is fantastic. There's wonderful people that come out and support the iCows that just kayak. That's another neat thing. And then you do have swim buoys, or whatever you call it, behind you. You put around your waist so you can kind of identify that you can see them out there. So.
Yeah, so these bright orange buoys, they're tethered. There's a strap that you put around your waist, and it doesn't affect your swimming at all, but it's there as a visibility so that the boats can see you. And also, if you do have a problem, you can grab a hold of this thing.
Right.
And
it's a fun group, and then I think afterwards, everybody gets together and have a little snack, and it's good camaraderie. So, I'd highly suggest it. It's a great group. If you do want to,
Yeah.
get into open water, it's a
Right.
great place. What a wonderful place McBride is
Right.
to do it.
Yeah, and thinking about, here in Iowa City, I mean, I don't know where all the listeners are for this podcast, but in Iowa City, we're very, very lucky. We have some wonderful indoor and outdoor pools. We also have two private swim clubs as
Right.
well. The university has iFly, and then the city has the Eels swimming. And that Eels Masters team started in the 1980s. And they're about to start a long distance and open water division, and I'm
Great.
working with them to be the coach of that
Great.
group.
When's that start? Year after first?
So probably soon after the first of the year,
Right.
people will actually be able to sign up for that. So there will be a distance training, a pool distance training component that's year round. But then when the weather gets better and the opportunity is there to swim outdoors, we'll swim outdoors. And so the idea is that there will be one group called something like the Explorers, where these are people who have not experienced open water swimming very much or at all, and they want to just kind of stick their toe in the water, so to
Right.
speak, and see what this is like. And then the other division we'll call the Channel Division. And so this is for my view of this, how this will work is that it'll be a fairly small number of people that I'll individually work with who really truly have the ambition to swim a channel sometime, a distance of 10 miles or more.
Right. That's pretty neat. Who's eligible for this? Is it students at U of I or
Well,
public? Or
yeah, this is public. This is
public?
completely public. So it'll be with the Eels Club. So this is a team that the City of Iowa City Parks and Rec has supported again since the 1980s, and it's associated with USA Swimming and US Masters Swimming, so coaches are have training and experience, and the Eels have kids 7, 8 years old all the way up through
Right.
old fogies like me.
Right. Well, I couldn't think of a better teacher than you with what you've done. So let's go into some long swims because the endurance events, I'm always fascinated with the athletes, the mindset, with what people go through to do it. Let's talk about Catalina. And you did Catalina, what, 3 or 4 years ago?
2016.
16. So it's been
Time
longer.
flies.
Time flies, yeah. And I'm getting grayer all the time. So is that from LA to Catalina Island?
Yeah, it's between the two, and you can do it either direction.
Right. And you started at Catalina, or
Yeah, so when I did it, I started at Catalina.
about 13 hours, right? I
Yep,
looked
it
up.
took me 12 hours, 59 minutes. I always like to tell people I made it under 13 hours.
Under 13.
Under 13.
But tell us about that adventure, what you
Sure.
went through.
Well, so first of all, to do a channel swim like that one, it's a solo swim. So a lot of times I think people are surprised at that. They say, well, why don't you swim with somebody else, or why can't there be a group? And the thing is, so many things are variable, not just with the weather and the conditions and so on, but with the individual. That if you were swimming in a group on a 22-mile swim, if something happened to one of those swimmers in that group and they had to be taken to a hospital, let's say, it would be over for everybody. Okay, so for that reason and some other reasons as well, those swims are always solo swims. So when you decide you want to do a swim like that, there's a lot of things to consider. First of all, is you have to just convince yourself that you might actually be able to do it. So you have to kind of go through a process of doing longer and longer swims. And, things like being able to, say, swim 10 kilometers in a day at a swimming pool, and then do that the next day, and then do it the next day. So you have to do a lot of volume of swimming to see if your body will just kind of put up with that. And then there's a big mental component to that too, right? If you're going to be kind of alone in your head for 10 to 20 hours, you have to kind of know what that would be like. So I think thinking back to my first channel swim, I was a nervous wreck. I mean, it's just I had so many doubts and so unsure about how would this go, worried about the weather, all those things. Finishing that swim was just an enormous kind of breakthrough, because it's like, okay, I've answered that question. I can do that. So part of training for an open water swim is just bringing yourself to a point where you can, in a rational way, say, I think I could do this, right? You don't know always for sure. So for Catalina, that's a process that starts a couple years ahead of your swim, because you have to do some qualifying swims, and so I had to do an open water swim at 60 degrees or below for 8 hours, and it had to be witnessed. And then that was part of my application to the Channel Federation. So each one of these big channels, the English Channel, the Catalina Channel, the New York Marathon Swim, all of those have a federation and a board, and they have criteria, and they will sanction your swim, and then they'll provide observers, and then it'll be officially registered that you finished the swim. So that process takes a couple of years ahead of time. So you have a lot of planning, and then there's a lot of logistics. In California, for example, we had to find a place to stay. I had a crew. My crew consisted of about 10 people: my wife, my daughter, several swimming friends. Came out. There was somebody who was in charge of my nutrition, John Little, who we both know, was in charge of my feeds, and those feeds have to be done without touching anything or anybody. They're liquid, but have a lot of carbs and hydration, as you were saying before. If it's warm, especially, you'll sweat.
How'd you get the feeding? It was like a fishing pole. They have a line out to you.
Yeah, it's just I would drink half a liter of liquid with about 85 grams of carbs. That's kind of tied to my body weight. And it was just thrown to me, but there was a string on it. So when I was done, I would just let go, and then the person in the kayak would pull it back. So, I mean, you also have to learn how to eat and get things to settle when you're, in the ocean, which can be, it can be motion. So you have to figure out what way of feeding you can tolerate. And that's, there's the cold water, there's the swimming in rough water, sighting, being able to, breathe to both directions. A lot of people have a favorite side to breathe.
Right.
There's some people who have only one side that they think they can breathe on. But if you're going to swim in open water, you have to learn to breathe to both sides, because if you've got a 20-mile-an-hour wind coming at you from the left, you have to breathe to the right.
Right. So how cold was the water in Catalina?
So it started at 68 and then ended at 63. So I swam from the island. And the other thing that surprises people is that these long swims like that usually start at night, like between 10 and midnight. And so you're swimming the first roughly 6 hours of these swims in the dark. Wow. But you do that for a reason. It's not just to be weird or scary.
Right.
It's because the sea is calmer during the night. There's not as much wind blowing. And so you try to get as much of the swim in before the sun heats up the air, and air starts to move, and the water starts to get rough. So my Catalina swim started at midnight, and I finished at 1 p.m.
Tell us what you saw at night. Didn't you talk about luminescence? And just tell us, was a whale come up, or did you see wildlife, fish?
Saw dolphins during the night. I had a very, almost like an apparition, there was a full moon for my Catalina swim. And so I could see down pretty far. And there were about 3 dolphins at this one point that I saw swimming past. And Hal Ide was my kayaker, who's a very good painter.
Right.
And I didn't have a camera. There was no way to capture this, this image. But as I stopped for a few seconds and I described what I was seeing. And then later he painted this. And, so there's some just amazing things to see. But to be totally honest, most of the time you're just swimming. And you're not seeing beautiful scenery. I mean, as the sun comes up, that's beautiful, things like that. But for the most part, it's a kind of a tough just endurance thing. And you, interestingly, people say, "What do you think about for that long?" And the correct answer is, I think about swimming. If you and you know this, you're an endurance athlete yourself. If you let yourself mind wander to too many other things, you can come back to the fact of what you're doing and go, "What am I doing? This is crazy. Why am I doing this?" So you think about swimming almost all the time.
Do you break it down like I'm going to go another 1,000 meters or so many strokes, or to get through the hours, because you got 13 hours out there or whatever?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, if you're doing any kind of endurance thing for that many hours, you have to feed. Right. So, I mean, for me, I can't go more than about 5K swimming without starting to get cramps if I don't. And also just I'll bonk. I'll won't have any fuel left in the tank, and I'll be done. So you have to do that. So that helps break it up. All right. So what I did was every hour I had one of these feedings with my carb supplement. And then if the sun was up and it was warm enough, then I would also drink electrolytes on the half hours. So a lot of these swims, as you pointed out, are cold. The water's cold. And I don't have a good answer as to why that is, honestly. Why do they, have the most famous swim in the world in the English Channel, where the water temperature is rarely above the low 60s? I don't know.
Yeah.
There are warmer swims, but they're not the big ones.
Right. I swim in Hawaii a little bit when I go over there, and you swim in
Yeah.
the Ironman swim in Kona with John Little, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I think the water temperature is like 78.
Yeah,
Might
it's
even
in the
be
70s.
Higher.
Yeah.
So,
We've been over there mostly in January and February, and the water is, probably around 70, which for me, this is a beautiful temperature. I love that.
yeah. So let's go back to Catalina. So
Yeah.
you're swimming along and you're thinking about 30-minute increments or whatnot. They can't touch you. You hand you a bottle and then they rope it or
Right.
bring
Pull
it
it
back
back.
in, pull it back in. Is it one set of goggles and one swim cap?
Yeah, so you're allowed to wear a pair of goggles, one swim cap, and swim trunks, and that's it. Some of these swims have a very, very long history. So the Catalina swim started in the 1920s. Actually, it's a good story in itself, but the short version is that Wrigley, the famous Wrigley from Chicago, bought Catalina Island and wanted to. Here, it's a real estate story for you, Gary. And he wanted to develop it for tourism. And so what he wanted to do was to convince people that Catalina Island was a great place to be year round. So the first Catalina Channel crossing was in January.
Okay. Wow.
And the water was quite cold. And they did a national call out for people to compete. And I think the prize was like $25,000. It was very significant for the 1920s. And they had over 100 people who actually came and did it. And so the first person to cross did it in January in 1927, I think it was. Wow. And by the time I did my swim in 2016, there were only 400 people who had done it. Mm-hmm. So in about 90 years' time, the number of people crossing. Now these days, there are more people crossing every year than there were for a lot of those years.
Wow, that's amazing. 1 of 400. That's just outstanding. Did you use any like Vaseline? I've heard that people put lard or they put Vaseline or something on your skin, or do you just?
I think for a long time there was this idea that you could put enough like wool fat or something on your body that it would be like an insulating layer. The truth is that's almost of no actual value for keeping you warm, but that you get friction spots and under here and different places where you have friction and your skin gets really raw. So having that coating on those spots is really essential. But what I use and most swimmers use for that length of swim is a mixture of like lanolin, which is like diaper rash cream, mixed together with zinc oxide. So when the sun comes up, you have protection from the sun. And that mixture is actually quite hard to get off. It takes usually a few days after a swim like that to get that all the way off.
I know when I swim, of course, not near that far, I use Body Glide, but I think that would probably wash off.
Well, I think that also helps to put a wetsuit on and off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And wetsuits are absolutely forbidden in open water swimming, like triathlons.
I can see that.
Yeah.
So we're at, tell us a little, so you got through Catalina, you had quite a support staff. Tell us about that last hour or so mentally, what you went through. I think your daughter was out there with you, wasn't she?
So what happened is that just as the sun was coming up, it was about 6 hours in, I was starting to get muscle cramps in my neck and my upper back, and it was very painful. And the big boat with the rest of the crew was about 50 feet away, but my daughter was on the kayak right next to me, and I was trying to tell her that I am in so much pain. I've never been in this much pain before swimming. I don't think I'm going to be able to finish this swim. I think I'm going to have to get out. And she was like, well, I understand. And the other people on the boat were over there. They couldn't hear me. And they were cheering me on and saying, oh, you're great. This is fantastic. You look really good. And I was using some really bad language.
Right.
I was saying, this pain is so bad. They don't know. I think I'm going to have to get out. And, they were making it very hard for me. My daughter says, look, Dad, it's okay. I understand. if you have to get out, you have to get out. He says, just do me a favor. My two sisters will never forgive me, right? They'll never understand. So wait until mom comes back out to the kayak before you quit.
It's good psychology.
So I took a bunch of ibuprofen. I have to say, I think I took about 6 ibuprofen, and then her shift didn't end for about another half hour. At the end of that half hour, thank God, I felt better. So then, and then I kept going. And for the Catalina swim, it's kind of odd because at the end of the swim, it gets toughest. So there's a current that's coming north to south along the coast of California, and it hits a shelf right about Point Vicente. It kicks the cold water up from the bottom. So the water temperature drops at that point about 3 miles from the end, and you're now into a current. So whereas I was making about 2 miles an hour for most of the swim, these last 3 miles, it's about 1 mile an hour.
Oh, wow.
And so at that point, you have to swim probably the hardest that you've been swimming the whole, for me, whole 10 hours before that. And you try to keep from looking at the end, because it always looks closer than it is. And so mentally that just gets to be terrible because you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not getting anywhere.
Right.
So you try not to look ahead, or typically your crew are kind of given the instruction, don't tell him how far it is.
Right.
Don't tell him, just don't answer that question.
Right. So you got there. Tell us about how you felt. You mean you set a goal, obviously, years before. You talked about it in one of your training sessions. You had an 8-hour swim at night, cold water, all the things you went through. Then here you are, that last 300-400 meters. What was that like?
It's a tremendous feeling, obviously. I mean, there's a lot of exhaustion, but for the most part, I don't remember feeling like I was having any trouble swimming. I just, you just kind of keep moving, right? Most of my crew got to join me for the last couple hundred meters so that they could come ashore with me, right? They couldn't touch me until I was out of the water and up on dry land. But what was kind of funny is I have a sister who was along on my crew, and it was sunny and the weather was really nice. And I was just in the water swimming, and she had forgotten that the water was about 63 degrees. And so she went to jump in, and I was up ahead, and I heard somebody scream.
Right.
I kind of paused for a second, looked back, and it was my sister, and she had just totally forgotten. She doesn't swim in 63 degrees water very often.
Did she stay out there?
Yeah, she did. She went ahead and swam in, and that's actually pretty rough. When you come ashore and you've been floating in water for 13 hours, your legs, the transition back to standing is really tricky, and that was a very rocky shore. So coming ashore there was a swell that would kind of push you over the rocks, and finally was able to kind of like hang on to some rocks long enough as the water went back out that I could stand back up, and then the swim was over.
Since we're in Iowa, a lot of people, hopefully not a lot, but people probably don't realize the buoyancy in salt water compared to fresh water.
There are advantages.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, if you're in salt water, you can just float, or get into trouble, you can just lay there and
it helps.
Around.
It does help. It actually makes the swimming easier. So training in freshwater and then doing events in saltwater is kind of a bonus. It's kind of like athletes who train at high altitude and then compete at sea level, something like that.
So you set the goal, you completed it, you're done. How'd you feel after you're done in the next couple of days? How was your body? And did you feel like you trained enough, or do you feel if you did it again, would you do different types of training regimens?
No, in fact, I felt very fortunate that I had gotten I know a lot of others, distance swimmers around the world, and it kind of collected a lot of different ideas and approaches. And I the training regimen that I had was just right for me.
Good.
And so I would repeat that. As a coach of athletes like this, it's partly passing on that knowledge and that experience, but part of the experience is that each person is a little different. So that's why it takes so long to prepare for one of these events, because you have to actually put yourself into these situations and see how you respond. You have to swim for 4 hours and try to eat while you're floating in the water, and then continue swimming, because some people, it's very hard to do, and their stomach, it needs to digest, and you're kind of in a weird position because you're not standing vertically, so gravity's not helping you get food down. So you just have to try different things and see what works.
Well, part of open water swimming, you're going to get some waves. You could get into rough seas. There's all kinds of things that can happen. It can turn quite fast.
Yeah.
You're out
Seasickness is an issue.
there. Yeah. Do you focus on the? Do you look up during that when it's getting rough, or do you keep your eyes focused on maybe something up ahead of you on the ground?
It's kind of funny because what I've read and what I've experienced about seasickness. Luckily, I don't experience much seasickness. I've almost never experienced seasickness. But what happens in events, so like the swim that I did in Western Australia, that was a 20K swim from Perth to an island, point to point. And most of the time, the water was too deep and you didn't see anything when you looked down. But as you got within a couple miles of that island, it was kind of a shallowing up in a reef, and there was a lot of seagrass. So one of the effects that made a lot of people sick in that race is that as you're moving along the surface and you're feeling the waves moving you one way, and then you look at the seagrass and the current in the underwater water movement is different.
Yeah.
It's disorienting,
Right.
and it makes people sick.
Right.
So one of the people that I trained with there got sick and vomited a number of times and almost didn't get to finish, but he was close enough to the end. But he was dangerously dehydrated when he got to the end because of that.
And is that type of is that inner ear where that comes from? Do they know when you get motion sickness or whatnot?
Again, the physiology of sports, right, is fascinating. In this particular sport, there are some really interesting things. So, in fact, people who get seasick, there's a theory out there among geneticists that it's actually a positively selected trait. That if you vomit more easily than other people, you actually have a genetic advantage. Okay, and the reason is that a few thousand years ago, when people weren't raising their food and eating it out of plastic containers, they were foraging, and if you would eat something that was poisonous, the faster you threw it up, the more likely you were to survive. So it's actually kind of one of those backwards things. When you think of vomiting, you think it's pretty much just a bad thing. But
so Catalina again was it 21 miles?
Yep, 21 and a half miles straight. These swims are never straight though, because there's always currents and so on.
And right at 12:59, whatever.
Yeah, 13 hours. Yeah.
That's still amazing. Tell us a little bit. I wanted to skip over. You got several swims here I want to talk about, but tell us a little bit about, you just prepared, I think, this summer, and we're trying to attempt the English Channel, which is that's probably the most famous swim, it sounds like, people doing the English Channel.
By far. Yeah.
How far was it? And, is it over 21?
It's almost exactly the same distance as the Catalina Channel. Okay. And the water temperature is very similar. In fact, when we were there, we were trained. So I went over at the end of August, and I had a 10-day window. One of the things about the English Channel is that weather is a much bigger variable than it is in Southern California. So for my Catalina swim, I had a day that was for my swim, and I had a contract with my skipper to pilot me across, and we swam on that day. If the weather was so bad that I couldn't swim on that day, that was it. You could hang around, and most of the skippers would try to accommodate, making it up if they had an open day in the next, but there's no guarantee of that. For the English Channel, you contract with a skipper for a 10-day window, and there's usually 3 other swimmers on that same boat for those 10 days. And so during those 10 days, you communicate all the time with your skipper, and you get notified when it's going to be your day. And at about 6 p.m. that in the evening, you get notified, we're going to swim tonight at 10 o'clock or at 1 o'clock or whenever they decide they want to start. For this year, there had been a lot of great successful crossings all summer long. The weather had been very, very good. In fact, they're having a drought in Europe, if you remember back, in 2022. So there was not much rain, not much severe weather. crossings were going really smoothly. The day we arrived in Dover, the weather was great. The day after that, it was not great. And there was an Atlantic cyclone. You could see it on the weather maps, and it was just kicking this wind straight up the channel. And the English Channel narrows down to 21 and a half miles at the point between Dover and Calais. It's huge everywhere else. So what happens is as the tide is shifting twice a day, it speeds up a lot going through that very narrow space. So the currents going back and forth can be like 8 to 10 miles an hour. And so you go through there when there's a neap tide. So that is when the moon is such that there's a smaller volume of water moving, but it's still quite a bit. But because of those tides and all the ferries and ships that are going through there, the pilots of these boats have to be able to maneuver and keep you safe. And if the wind is now a factor, and there were 20-mile-an-hour winds, swimming at 2 miles an hour, the skippers can't keep the swimmers out of the way of the boats.
Right.
So you just don't go. So in fact, if the forecast is for wind above 15 knots, nobody goes. So we sat there for 10 days. And after about 7 days, we pretty much knew we weren't going to get our chance to do that. And I was there with Guillermo Romano Ibarra, and we were going to swim it as a relay.
Are you you're thinking about that again, or regroup on it?
Yeah, I won't be doing it. I turned 63 last week, and it's not that there's an age limit for it, but I have grandkids and have family and things that we like to do. And I think what's easy to overlook is what a burden training for an event like that can be. And then the logistics and carving out the chunk of time on the calendar to go and do that. There's obviously a lot of expense. It's not inexpensive to fly to England and then find a place to stay for 2 weeks. And so I won't be trying that again. But while I was there, I met a lot of other really wonderful, interesting swimmers from around the world. And I think my next big swim is going to be the Strait of Gibraltar. And it's not logistically as complicated. The weather's pretty consistent, and it's about 12 miles. And you can do it, with a small group. So I'm hoping to get together, a few people who have this interest in doing it and maybe do that in the summer of 24.
And that you're with your new swimming group as a coach,
Yeah.
able to train people to.
We'll see.
What they're gonna face.
It's so new, Gary, that
Yeah.
it's not even completely settled yet. But it looks like around the first of the year, we'll start trying to identify people who might be first wanting to explore a longer distance swimming and then open water or wild swimming, and then find a few people who are really serious about it. It's not everybody.
No,
It's
I
not
was
for
going to say
everyone.
that's a select few.
Well, I don't know. I kind of resist the idea that somehow it's an exceptional thing in a really positive way. I think that different people have different interests. I mean, I know some people who love to make quilts.
Right.
That's not for me.
Right.
But it's an incredible
Right.
commitment, right? And it's a dedication and so on. And I think for this, there are people out there who maybe would really like this challenge, and thankfully, I have the experience and have accumulated knowledge about what's involved in doing this. As I was figuring this out, mostly it was kind of on my own, and sometimes I probably had a lot more anxiety and challenges. I could have done some things better or a little easier, and hopefully it'll be a rewarding experience not only for the swimmers but for me as well.
So once you completed Catalina, you knew you could do it.
Yeah.
So if there's another challenge, you can get through it. You have to pay the price to train and do all the things you did. But once you do that and you prepare yourself, you're ready to go.
I have
'cause
to,
you've done it.
I have to say, if I hadn't done Catalina, I probably wouldn't have answered your question about the English Channel and whether I wanted to try it again differently.
Right.
Because the fact that I've done a channel that's so similar to that, it's not like I have as much of a mystery. But I would love to go back over to Dover with another swimmer and help them
Coach them.
to get across. Yeah.
Tell us about, I got some other swims written down here, but tell us a little bit about Alcatraz. Everybody knows where that is in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge. obviously Alcatraz, the prison. So
Yeah, yeah. So Alcatraz is not a real long swim, but it's a cold swim. The water is usually in the low 50s, and there's also a really strong tide that comes in and out of San Francisco Bay. So you have to know what you're doing and have knowledge of a local expert to time your start. So we found a company. Actually, Hal Ide found this company called Swim Art, and they do kind of boutique custom support for swims. And we had about a dozen people that went out. I think it was in 2015, and the time when you have to time it so that the tide is just about at its where it's changing directions, right? And so you can make it kind of swim a little bit off target to where you go from Alcatraz to Aquatic Park. There's a bay there at Ghirardelli Square. And you're usually aiming, we were aiming a little bit west, and then the current dragged us back as it switched, and pretty much shot it right in the opening of that bay.
Did you start off the back of a boat?
Yeah,
Did you jump off?
We go off a boat. You're not actually allowed to get onto Alcatraz Island. So you get as close as you can get, and then you jump off the boat toward the island, and then you start swimming back. It was a very rough swim.
Right.
The day that we did it, there was the sea was really unsettled. There's also boat traffic through there, but that was not a really big issue. And then we had kayakers that kept us going the right direction, and were there just in case something went wrong.
There were sharks, weren't there?
There we go.
I have to mention sharks.
So I have to say that when people have a chance to kind of like ask me a question, quite often the first question is, "Aren't you afraid of sharks?" And my answer that I've kind of curated over the years is, if I see a shark, I'm paying attention to it.
Right.
I mean, you'd be a fool not to respect that predator, but they're not all predators. I've done, and I'm sure you have in Hawaii, seen
Right.
sharks. They're beautiful creatures, and they're not out there all the time thinking, "How can I go eat a human today?"
Right.
In fact, you usually won't see sharks because they'll see you before you see them, and they get away,
Right.
like other fish. But in San Francisco Bay, there definitely are sharks, and surfers have to beware. If they go down, windsurfers are pretty common under the Golden Gate Bridge. After we did our swim, a couple of weeks later, there was a video on YouTube of a great white taking one of the seals that was there. And it was right exactly on the path that we had swam. So it was kind of exciting, but at the same time, I was kind of glad it was the seal, not me.
Yeah. Hey, have you ever, in Hawaii, I've been with the dolphins and swam with them. Have you ever done that? They're amazing.
Yeah, at a distance. My own personal experience is I have not been really close to dolphins. But a year after I did my swim, Liz Uribe, who swam Catalina the year after me, I was on her crew at about 2 or 3 in the morning. And you mentioned bioluminescence before.
Right.
Partly as effective climate change. There are more places in the world now with bioluminescence, which just means as you go through the water and disturb it, I think it's chlorophyll or whatever in the water lights up. It's energized by the movement of the water. So during Liz's swim, at a time, and her swim was overcast, and so she didn't have the moonlight like I had. So this bioluminescence of these dolphins that came right to her, okay, and were swimming under her and jumping over her in the darkness, right? So there's some light from the boat, so you could kind of see the splashes and see the dolphins come above the water a little bit, but you could actually see them under the water because they were leaving these green, luminescent trails. It was incredible.
Sounds amazing.
It was really incredible.
If you get around dolphins, the few times I've been in the ocean with them, they seem like they're almost human.
Yeah.
They almost can talk to you. They come up to you. It's just amazing. I highly recommend it if you ever get in the ocean to swim with dolphins if you get that close to them.
Yeah. This book again that I mentioned before, Swimming to Antarctica by Lynn Cox, she had a couple of experiences where dolphins came very close to her. And one of them was in South Africa, where there was probably a much greater danger of great white sharks than almost any other place in the world. They're around there because there's a lot of food for them there. And the way she tells the story in the book, you know, is really pretty awe-inspiring because these dolphins seem to have been trying to protect her, right? Trying to, you know, swim close to her to keep between her and sharks. And it just kind of gives me goosebumps to think about it.
They say they will protect you from sharks.
Yeah.
And they take sharks on.
Yeah, the Cook Strait in between the two islands, two halves of New Zealand. She had another swim there where dolphins definitely were swimming around her, and then toward the end they showed up again, and there was a big shark, and they kind of stayed between her and the shark.
Tell us about Turkey, the swimming. Was it Dardanelles Strait?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
So in about 2013 or 2014, I had, coming back from Australia, I had met a bunch of Australians who kept talking about this swim called the Hellespont. And the swim is in the Dardanelles Strait between the Asia and the Europe part of Turkey. Turkey is actually in both continents, and it's separated by this body of water, the Bosphorus. And there's also the Gallipoli battlefield there, right, which is historically very important to Australians. So Australians would kind of, as a mecca, kind of go there, visit the battlefield, and then they do this swim. So once a year, the Turks put on this race that swims across the Dardanelles. And so I'd heard a lot about it and was interested in doing it. There's also was a book written about that time by Lynn Shear about, you know, why people love swimming, and she was doing this swim herself. So, and then finally there was a company called Swim Trek that organizes swim vacations. And my wife and I, in addition to this swim, to going to do that one, we also went to the Galapagos Islands with Swim Trek, and you swim around the islands with all the sea life over there. But this was a lot of fun because there was about 400 swimmers from around all over the world. I mean, really all over the world. And these small towns on both sides of the strait where people stay have very few hotel rooms, so they pair you up. So I went there and I shared a room with a guy from the UK, and it was just a lot of fun. And doing that swim, I don't know, there was just something about kind of the extreme international nature of it. That channel, the last thing I'll say about it is that it has a historical component, and that is that Lord Byron swam this in about 1824. There's the myth of Hero and Leander, and that he swam across at night to be with his lover. And so that, to many people, is the origin of modern open water swimming. It was Lord Byron swimming across that strait.
That was a rough swim, wasn't it?
That was a very rough swim.
Right. A lot of swells.
It was so the strait takes a big dog leg right at the starting line. And the wind was coming straight down this long stretch. So there are these huge waves breaking on the beach at the start. And then you swam out into the channel and then downstream to the finish. So there were these huge waves coming in. And there was actually a lot of the swimmers, probably about a quarter of the swimmers, who couldn't get started. They just, you know, because a lot of people train for that swim thinking that it's has so much history and it's kind of romantic and all of these thoughts. And this is one of those cases where people are, wanting to do an open water swim. So they get advice. And one of the bits of advice that they get is you better go do some open water swimming first. Yeah. But a lot of people just, they think, oh, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. I won't have a problem. And, especially they don't go out and train when the weather's bad. So this start, it actually helped me. It was one of the few times in my swimming career that I got on the podium of a swim like that. And it was because about half the field didn't get to finish. So I didn't have as much competition, but I love it when it's actually very rough. It's kind of fun. And maybe it's because I'm kind of thick and heavy and I kind of have some stability.
How far was that swim?
That was only about a 5K swim.
Okay,
but you had a strict time limit of 90 minutes that they shut down the ships going through there for this race. As soon as the 90 minutes are over, the boats are out picking all the swimmers up that didn't make it across. So even if you're only 200 meters from the finish at the 90 minutes, you're out.
Tell the listeners about something that you've done in the past. It sounds really, I never did get to do this, but the swim trips to Croatia.
Yeah.
and you got a sailboat, and you had a great group of people, and you swim a couple times a day, and what a beautiful country. Just tell us a little bit about that, those vacations.
Yeah. So, Swim Trek, this company that organizes these swimming adventures, they have one that goes to Croatia. And in 2014, I was not aware of that trip. My oldest daughter, in this case, after she got married, she is a high school teacher. She and her husband went to Italy and spent a year teaching there. Okay, and right in Trieste, in the northern part of Italy, right at the border of Croatia. They didn't do this themselves, but they heard from friends how wonderful it was to go sailing in Croatia. So we were trying to come up with an idea for a family vacation. And my wife and I had kind of saved for a special vacation. And this daughter and her husband said, well, maybe we should go to Croatia. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? I was like, where did you get this idea? And she told us where she got the idea and said, yeah, we could all live on a sailboat for a week. It's like, oh, I don't know, live on a sailboat. I mean, I love all of you, but a week on a boat altogether, I'm not sure.
How many people?
That's about 10 of us, family. And so I Googled it. And what I found was this Swim Trek thing. And it showed people swimming off the boats and doing these long swims in these really beautiful clear water with this wonderful setting, with all the limestone and these islands. And so I said, okay, we'll try it. We'll go. So in 2014, we did that the first time. And it was just our family. Well, after that, I was just like, I got to go back and do this again. So I talked to a few the ICOWS members into going as a group. And so we split the cost of the boat, about 8 ways. So it was a lot more affordable than when I paid the bill for all my kids to go. And we just had an incredible time. And we've made these really strong connections with this Croatian family that owns the boat that we usually rent. And now we go back every 2 years. 2020, that was disrupted because of COVID, but then we went in 2021, and then we went again this year in 2022. And we typically now go for 2 weeks, and we'll have 2 separate crews that do those 2 weeks, but it's just a wonderful experience. The water's in the 70s. We get to swim wherever we want, whatever distances we want. And it's just
Then you get out and you get on your bikes, right?
Yep.
Have fun and see castles.
It is. It's just Croatia is a really special place. The archipelago has about 1,100 islands, so we'll never run out of places to sail and bays to anchor in for the night. But then, as you mentioned, there's other activities when we go ashore and we rent bikes and do some other exploring on foot as well.
All kinds of things to do with swimming, isn't there?
Yeah.
Starting to lose my voice.
Well, almost anything that you have that's a passion, you can usually find ways to kind of boomerang that into interacting. So a lot of travel that we've done. I mean, I've done swims on all the continents except Antarctica. Almost all the oceans and seas around the world, and it's almost kind of like you put up a list. If you Google top 100 open water swims in the world, you'll find a Wikipedia page that has the kind of a ranking of all these really great swims.
So let's go back into your coaching and maybe to wrap it up here. Talk to people a little bit about if they're just starting to think about swimming. And how do I get started? We've talked about 20 miles, 21 miles, and swimming a channel.
Yeah, you don't want to think about that if you're just starting.
Not initially, yeah. Because a lot of people fear it and they don't know how to breathe. And what would be some ideas for the listeners that, hey, I'm just getting started and I do want to do some things. Maybe they're starting to get into triathlon or they want to do an open water swim. What would be some ideas that you give somebody as a novice getting started?
Well, I have about a million thoughts related to the things you just said. The first thing I will say is that, like most skills in life, the earlier in life you start, the easier it is.
Right.
Okay, but that doesn't mean that you can't start at any time. Okay, but I think it's definitely something to be realistic about, right? That the learning curve is not just a little harder, a little steep. It's a different learning curve. When you're my grandkids, I don't know whether you call them lucky or not, but before they turned one, I'd had them in the water many times. And now they're, between 4 and 6 years old, and they're incredible swimmers. They absolutely love the water. And it's so easy, right? One of my grandkids' fathers barely swims at all, right? He didn't swim when he was a kid. And it's probably not something that will ever be easy for him to do. But if you have a desire to do something, that's very healthy. I mean, the health benefits of swimming have been so extensively documented that it's just, there's no question that it has not just physical positive, effects for people, but it lacks negative effects, right? So running
in your joints. And
yeah, it's very low
knees.
impact, very low impact, and it's. I will just share, the thing that I like the most about swimming is just literally the feeling of floating and flying underwater. When I push off the wall in a pool, I just love to just kind of move in that direction very smoothly with no resistance, no weight bearing. It just is a great feeling. But for people who want to maybe take up swimming, as adults, I would say if you're close to where you and I are right now, there's a lot of opportunities. So as I said, there are these masters teams, but masters teams don't just work with people who are expert swimmers. They actually work with people from wherever they are and help them develop skills, help them come up with, appropriate goals. And, like anything, the longer you stay with it, the more you'll surprise yourself with where you can go.
There's a lot of technique. I think people don't realize that, but once you learn those techniques, like a golf swing, you can practice it.
Right.
But you got to learn proper technique.
You do, and you have to be patient with it because trying to coordinate that many muscles and through that many joints is for some people maybe it's very intuitive, but for most people it's not. And so it really helps to have somebody who's kind of telling you, okay, think about this one thing today. So let's swim for the next 10 minutes and think about this one thing. And then once you've got that, say, now think about this one other thing. Because if you just read a book about swimming and then tried to go do it on your own, you could probably do it with enough time, but it kind of helps to, I usually have someone just get in and watch them swim. And usually I see a lot of good things, right? And say, okay, but now here's one thing that if you'll think about, you're raising your elbow a little higher or try to extend and roll a little bit more, or when you catch with your hand this way, to make sure you do this, first. I think anybody can do it. The good news is it's not a skill that you're going to throw away ever, because you can be 95 years old and you can still be swimming.
I think the neat thing is, it's for me, after a good swim, it's relaxing. It kind of calms you down. And it's a different type of exercise. Most people can run or ride a bike, but it's that fear of swimming. But I think once you get in the pool a little bit, for me, it took me probably 3 or 4 weeks to kind of get over the hump because I hadn't really swam a lot. But I think if you just force yourself to get in there, if you really have some goals or you want to do something, you pick it up. And then have some good instruction. We got great places in Iowa City. Yeah. The Wellness Center at the University of Iowa is fabulous, those pools. City Park's just fantastic in the summer to get up there and go in the morning. So we got great venues to learn how to swim.
Yeah. I mean, there's Mercer Pool, the Robert A. Rec Center, the North Liberty Pool, Coralville. I mean, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to pools in Johnson County. Most of the rest of the state just isn't even anything close to that.
Tell us again about your coaching. Lastly, to finish, you're going to start and embark after the first year.
Well, it's totally new. I'll share just a tiny story from when I was in high school. And I think everybody's had this experience when you're graduated from high school and, Uncle John says, so what are you gonna do with your life, son? What are you going to be? And the honest answer for most of us is, I have no idea. I don't know.
You went to the academy, didn't you?
Yeah, I went to the Air Force Academy.
Yeah.
And, but that question really, honestly, I was like, I wish people wouldn't ask me that question, but I didn't have any control over whether they asked me. So after a while I thought, I'm just going to have an answer. Okay. And if they're foolish enough to think that that I know that's really it, then that's up to them. So I always told people I want to be a math teacher and coach swimming. And so I'm an engineering professor, teach lots of math, but I've never actually been a real coach. I mean, I feel like a life coach, and I apply principles of coaching because I've been an athlete, and I've kind of used some of those things to motivate students, but I've never actually been a coach. So an opportunity here came up where the Iowa City Eels swim club hired a new head coach, Cheryl Tucker, and she has a lot of experience with training athletes. And I heard that she's just really fantastic, and I wanted to try something new, so I went back to swimming with that team. So I swim with that Masters team Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings, and it's been a great experience. And so after swimming for just a few weeks, we were talking afterwards, and she didn't know a lot about my open water experience. And so as we got talking about that, she got to thinking, we could really add a component to our Masters swimmers and to our senior, junior swimmers that might want to do longer distances, to add that component to the team. So we're kind of working out with the board of the Iowa City Eels now how this will take shape. And as I said before, my idea is that I'd have one group where we spent time in the pool, we spent time on the deck talking about a lot of the things that we've been talking about this last hour, and just kind of letting people know these different aspects of the sport. And then have a second group, which would be much more one-on-one coaching for people who kind of want to make that decision that say, oh, I think I might want to do, some big channel swim sometime, or a much longer swim. And there are freshwater swims that are not technically channel swims, but they're of that challenge level.
So to sign up, sign up through the Eels,
Yeah.
or contact
Yeah.
you, or
Yeah, and there's a really great Masters team at the University iFly age group club too. So both of those teams are do very similar things. They have training for kids and getting through all the different age groups. They go to swim meets. We're just very fortunate in Iowa City that we have two: the iFly team and the Eels team. The Eels team practices at the city facilities at Mercer Pool mostly, and then at City Park in the summer. The iFly swims exclusively at the university pools, the CRWC, and the field house.
great. Well, Tom, it's been fantastic. I just wanted to thank you again for coming in today and talking about swimming. And if you have an interest in, doing a long distance swim, get a hold of Tom, talk to the Eels Master Swimming Programs. We got great opportunities. We're just glad to have you.
Cool.
Thanks again.
Well, thanks, Gary.